It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster as Downing Street receives an update on the long-awaited report into Downing Street parties from senior civil servant Sue Gray. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, Labour MP Emma Hardy, Chief Executive of the Left of Centre think tank, the New Economics Foundation, Miata Fambule, and The Spectator's economics editor, Kate Andrews. So, Downing Street is reported to have a version of the Sue Gray report. It's expected to be published later, with a common statement from the Prime Minister at 3:30 this afternoon. This, as Boris Johnson tries to reset his government.
60 free trade deals, changing the way we support farmers, taking back control of our waters, taking back control of our borders, taking back control of our money.
But the Prime Minister continues to come under fire.
What do you think his relationship to the truth is?
Promiscuous.
Can Labour stop their MP for Canterbury leaving the party over online abuse?
I spoke to the leadership last night and there's conversations going on with her at the moment. But it's early days and we do need to sort something out and she does need to be supported.
Why do private school boys and girls still come out on top? And artists desert Spotify over this podcaster's coverage of COVID vaccines.
Thank you all the supporters and even thank you to the haters, because it's good to have some haters. It makes you reassess what you're doing and put things into perspective.
So, the news that report into Downing Street parties by the senior civil servant Sue Gray has landed with the Prime Minister and Number 10. We don't know the precise timings other than a statement at 3:30 this afternoon, but the Prime Minister will need to digest that report. He promised on at least two occasions that it would be published in full. Let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. Laura, there is some confusion, at least, as to exactly what the Prime Minister has been given. Is this the final report by Sue Gray? Is it her full report? Have the findings in any way been curtailed by what the Metropolitan Police said at the end of the last week when they called for minimal references to a number of the parties that they too were investigating?
So, Jo, big first caveat, we haven't seen it yet, we're not completely sure, we think it will go online at 1 o'clock. However, we do have some real clarity about whether or not this will be the full gory details of everything that went on behind the shiny black front door, or whether or not this will be a slimmed down initial report. We know that it will be very much an initial report. We know that because the Cabinet Office has very carefully, ahead of publication, said in black and white in an official statement that Sue Gray has provided an update to the Prime Minister, a very clear signal in Whitehallese, if you like, that this is not the full version of events. As you hinted at, it's likely that she has done this because the Metropolitan Police, after a whole load of backwards and forwards, asked the Cabinet Office to take out any of the gory, full information about exactly what went on during the rule breaking. But as a result of that, that means what we will get is a report that I understand will have conclusions and recommendations, but it will very much be an initial first version, not the complete account of every single thing that happened or revelations about every single piece of evidence that the Sue Gray inquiry team received.
Because so many people have been waiting for this report within the Conservative Party itself before making their own mind up about the Prime Minister and his future. We have the Conservative MP Tim Lawton here in the studio, who has already said that he thought the Prime Minister's position was untenable, but there are others that are waiting for this report. It's difficult to know if it will provide enough for them to make up their minds one way or the other.
That is hard to know, and you're absolutely right. It's one of the reasons why this report has become so politically important, because there are lots of Tory MPs who've been appalled by what they heard about the various different allegations of things that happened in Downing Street. But as you say, many of them wanted to reserve their final judgment on whether or not that meant that it might be time for Boris Johnson, in their view, to leave office or not. And the fact that they will not be getting the full version of events, therefore, and I've been talking to one of them this morning, who was saying, well, I'm just going to have to see. I don't quite know what I'm going to do yet. You know, there are plenty of MPs in that position. And the delay and the process has, of course, as well, given Downing Street a bit of a breathing space, a bit of an opportunity to talk about other subjects, to try to move the debate on. It's given Boris Johnson a bit of time also to do some cajoling and some arm twisting behind the scenes from MPs who maybe were wavering about whether or not they wanted to see a vote of confidence into him happen, whether or not they might be prepared to back those who are already arguing for him to leave office. So it's hugely important in the political sort of spectrum there, because it was this sort of moment of decision. What I would say, though, is two really important things. Nobody, apart from a tiny group of people, has seen this initial report. So the fact that it has been stripped back of some of the full details, that doesn't mean that it isn't going to be damaging. That doesn't mean that it isn't going to be embarrassing for the Prime Minister. I'm told there'll be things there about failure of leadership, things there about a drinking culture inside Downing Street. We'll see how he handles that in the House of Commons this afternoon. But the other hugely important thing here, you know, outside this square mile, outside this Westminster bubble, I'm not quite sure where a square bubble came from, many members of the public may have already made up their minds both about what happened here and perhaps also about what they think about the Prime Minister because of all of that. So this report is a very important political moment, very important for our viewers to realise today that this is not going to be the full story, but also hugely significant to think about the public's view of all of this. You know, we've talked for weeks about how many members of the public have been so upset, so angered by things that have come out over time, so upset by how that made them compare it to some of their own experiences during lockdown. So for all that round here, Westminster loves a process story, loves a conversation about a delay and who said what and where and how. The big picture for all of this is that the delay and the fact this is going to be an initial report, that might help Boris Johnson in the pacing of all of this and the handling of all of this. But that doesn't also mean that this hasn't still been an intensely damaging row. And even if this report sounds like it's possible for him to brush away, he's still got the threat of a police investigation. And one day, I'm sure, the opposition trying to insist that the full details of everything that Sue Gray found making their way into the public domain.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you very much. And come back before the end of the programme if you discover or find out anything else in terms of the contents of the report. And, of course, that statement by the Prime Minister this afternoon at 3:30. As I said, you'd already made up your mind that the Prime Minister should go. Well, how did you make up your mind?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I was getting quite a lot of emails from constituents, as all of my colleagues have been doing as well. I've been deeply uncomfortable with the way events have been unrolling in the last few weeks. And so I decided to, I didn't really go public, but I put out a piece for my constituents to read in reply. And I said, look, for me, it's not about how many sausage rolls were gobbled or warm Prosecco glasses were quaffed. It's not about the events themselves, actually, now. It's been about the way it's been handled over the last few weeks. And it's gone, there's been too much prevarication, too much evasion, I fear, and general chaos at a time when we absolutely need transparency, honesty, and we need number 10 to show integrity at a time when we need the confidence of the British public that the people setting the rules are doing it for the right reasons and are following them. If ever we needed that confidence, we need it now coming out of pandemics.
But he's still there, Boris Johnson. He's still Prime Minister. And at the moment, of course, we're awaiting his statement. But there'll be those who argue that he's safer today than he was perhaps a week or so ago. How disappointed are you by that?
I think there's been a bit of party fatigue. I mean, this has been going on and on. I think the media have overhyped it in places as well, which hasn't helped. But people, it's for every one of my colleagues to make their own mind up. And many of them wanted to see what was in that report. I took the view that I don't think there's anything in that report that could possibly completely vindicate, because it's not about the actual details of the events. And I just think he is damaged, which is a great pity after the huge amount of good work that Boris has done at a time when we need to have a government and the head of government who has the full confidence of the people going forward with all the other events going on in the world, not just the pandemic.
Have you put in a letter of no confidence?
Well, that's entirely a private matter, and I've not said one way or the other.
Right. I mean, has your mind been changed in terms of whether you are thinking about it, even if you don't tell us whether you've done it or not, or withdrawing it?
It's entirely a private matter.
Kate, is Tim, do you think, on the wrong side here when it comes to saying that the Prime Minister or his position is now untenable?
I'm inclined to agree with Tim. I mean, none of us are ever going to completely rule out Boris Johnson's ability to bounce back. He is a politician that seems to have 9 lives, but this is fundamentally different kind of scandal, because the scandals that have plagued Boris Johnson in the past have been baked into his roaring success on election day, and also have often made people think that he's a bit relatable. He's slightly misbehaved. He says things he shouldn't do, but who doesn't? And so they feel as if they can relate to not Johnson, not the prime minister, but Boris. The problem here is that everybody, going back to March to June 2020, knows exactly what they gave up. And in the better circumstances, it's still awful. It's their children's education, it's the ability to socialize, it's sitting home by yourself. And in the worst case scenarios, it's not being able to say goodbye to loved ones before they passed away. And so what he was doing and what his staff were doing no longer feels relatable in any way. In fact, it feels like the people who were making the rules were seriously taking advantage of their privileged positions.
All right.
I do think, however, the Prime Minister's been bought quite a bit of time because of the incompetency of the Met Police. And what he does with it will be quite telling if he can bring back some of those supporters by appealing to his base.
All right, well, before I bring our other guests in, let me put another viewpoint in terms of Boris Johnson's future. Last night, Cabinet Minister Michael Gove was interviewed on Channel 4's Dispatches programme. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
The Prime Minister has been clear that mistakes were made and he's taken responsibility for those. But I'm sure that when the report is published, there will be from individuals concerned, you know, a recognition, contrition and so on. And, you know, we owe them an element of Christian forgiveness.
Emma, do you agree? Is the Prime Minister owed an element of Christian forgiveness?
Well, to have Christian forgiveness, you first of all got to have a confession. You've got to confess to what you've done. You've got to be open and honest. That's how Christian forgiveness works. The confession comes first. Where is the confession from the Prime Minister? I mean, let's think about this for a moment. We have the Prime Minister of our country organising an inquiry to find out whether or not he attended a party. I mean, it's utterly farcical. And the general public have made their minds up about this. They don't like being taken for fools. They don't feel like the government are listening to them. And as Tim just said, you can't have a government setting the rules and then choosing to do one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. It's not a fair system. The Prime Minister has been investigated by the police. I mean, this isn't, you know, if it wasn't serious, we'd all be laughing and finding this utterly ridiculous until we remember that, hang on a minute, this is the man in charge of our country.
Well, except you say that everybody has made up their minds. If I show you this headline in The Times, we Tories will surrender the North if we lose Johnson. This is the Conservative Mayor of Tees Valley, Ben Houchen. He's thrown his support behind the Prime Minister and saying it is the only way to win those seats, those formerly Labour seats in the Red Wall. Tim?
Well, it's an interesting comment from Ben Houchen, and Ben Houchen has been a huge success at getting people to vote Conservative in a part of the country that didn't normally. The polling suggests otherwise, because I fear that the response from many people in Red Wall seats who invested their trust in the Conservatives for the first time in many cases, and particularly with Boris Johnson, suggests that they've not been very impressed with what's been going on as well. So there's going to be a huge job of restoring that trust, restoring confidence that needs to be done. And I just doubt whether we're going to be able to do it with all the other things that are going on in the world at the moment. We absolutely need to have leadership that is absolutely commands the confidence of most of the people in this country, be they Red Wall seats, be they south of the country or whatever. And I just think it's gone too far. With great regret, I say that, because, you know, I voted in the very final round for Boris, and I think if it weren't for him, we would not have got through the Brexit anarchy that we did, and we would not have been coming out of the pandemic in such a strong position as I believe that it will show us to have been. But this goes beyond that, and it's not a question of a policy change, as has happened, say, with Mrs Thatcher and poll tax. It's not a question of various ministers who perform badly could be sacked. All roads lead back to number 10 and the person whose name is on the door, and that's what I fear makes us different.
You would accept, though, Emma, that Boris Johnson was such a strong vote winner in those parts of the country where Labour had held seats for decades. Do you think that naturally Labour will inherit those seats as a result?
I don't think people in the north like being taken for fools or taken advantage of. And they're not idiots. The idea that they can't see through what the Prime Minister's doing and they can't see through what's happening in number 10, I think is frankly a bit insulting. And, there's no guarantee people are going to vote one way or another. That's not what this is about. But as Tim said, if people for the first time put their trust in Boris Johnson and then they see him carrying on with parties when they couldn't see loved ones, they couldn't go to funerals, they were stuck at home, they have a right to feel angry, and they are angry.
There is a reset operation going on, Miata, a blizzard of announcements by the government this week, including a Brexit freedom bill. What do you make of this attempt to point to other things that are going on in government by Boris Johnson?
I mean, it's inevitable. It feels a bit desperate. There is a kind of barrage of things coming through, some of it that feels pretty half-baked. I mean, the EU Freedom Bill, as the government wants to call it, for me, we haven't seen the details, so who knows? I think the two things that automatically make me nervous, partly because it feels like a desperate act to try and save the Prime Minister, is one, when they say red tape, they're talking about rights for workers, they're talking about environmental protections. So I want to see what rights for workers they want to cut away, what environmental protections they want to strip away. And the other thing that makes me nervous is it's giving ministers huge powers to make these decisions, some of which should be sitting with devolved administration, and quite frankly, most of which should be sitting with Parliament. Those two things, I think, are a worry. And the final thing I'd say is if the government is worried about business, which it should be, and worried about red tape, it needs to get Brexit to work. Because at the moment, businesses are facing more red tape, more restrictions, more costs out of Europe than they were before, when they were in Europe, because the government has not got this right. They've not got the deal right. Care about businesses, fix that first.
Tim?
Well, we don't know what's going to be in this Brexit freedom bill.
But we know the
bill
thrust is to make it easier to rip up, if you believe what the government is saying, EU regulations and protections.
No, it is there because as part of Brexit, we had to transfer a whole load of Brexit legislation or our EU membership legislation into UK law. And it was always the intention, there may be some conspiracy theory here, I don't think it's part of the reset, it was always the intention that we would then have to go through that, a huge amount of legislation, to see what is still appropriate to use in the UK and what's not appropriate. At the moment, EU law has precedence, if it's been set before 2020, over UK law. That cannot be right if we are now fully out of the EU. So it's about greater freedoms on agriculture. At last, our farmers can grow stuff that they want to grow that's most suitable for our local environments and climate, not what they're told to by Europe. On immigration, at last we can decide who comes into this country other than the people coming across the channel illegally.
If we're changing
a lot of other things like
for
that.
farmers, or we're changing things on immigration, then surely you, and I genuinely believe you care about Parliament, believe that this should be through primary legislation. This shouldn't be about handing greater powers to the ministers, as it appears to be proposed with this bill. This bill is talk. This bill is.
You haven't seen.
Well, neither of us have seen it. We've only read the newspaper article.
We'll have the opportunity to vote for it or to amend it in Parliament.
What I'm
make sure
asking
it's
you, Tim, though,
properly
as a
scrutinised.
parliamentarian, surely you would agree with me in saying that whenever we're looking at changing laws and regulations, they should come through primary legislation, they should be debated on the floor of the House, and it shouldn't be about giving
Emma,
more powers to ministers.
If we had to do everything by primary legislation,
you
we will be here
changing
24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So we have primary legislation for the big stuff, and we have secondary legislation.
You mentioned changing
as well.
immigration and farmers. They're big deals. They should come to Parliament. They should be debated.
Kate, I mean, in terms of whether the UK has made the most of Brexit, complaints and criticisms from some Conservative MPs that the government hasn't.
Well, it quite clearly hasn't yet, but I think if you want to be the most generous you can be, they have had other things on their mind the past 2 years. Something I would point to is our vaccine procurement and rollout. Technically, we could have gone independent still being in the European Union. We could have gone our own way, but the chances of having done so would have been slim to none. Being out of the European Union meant that we basically had to take it upon ourselves to work with our own nimble regulator, encourage them, bring in our top talent to procure the right vaccines. And that has been hugely successful, frankly, especially compared to our European counterparts. So frankly, I think the case for Brexit was made with that one topic alone. But when it comes to regulation, the red tape, the freedoms of Brexit, securing trade deals that aren't going to take a decade like Australia to eventually get over the line and benefit from, I think we have been quite woeful. And, I hear Miata's concerns, but frankly, when was the last time Conservative politicians actually did tear up that red tape? actually took it, threw it in the bonfire and set it alight. You know, we hear this a lot, and the fact that we don't really have the details of this Brexit freedom bill suggests to me that, you know, this is part of the government's Operation Red Meat. They want us to be talking about these big grand ideas around Brexit, but let's wait to see the actual details, because so far from this Boris Johnson government, when it comes to Brexit, apart from the COVID issues, they've mostly been talking about more state subsidy and things that a lot of the free marketeers claim they didn't want years ago, they want now. So get into the detail.
All right, I mean, it's true, isn't it, Miata? I mean, is regulation ever torn up in the way people promise?
It can be, or it can be changed to made more difficult. I mean, I do think I take Kate's point that there's a lot of talk and let's wait to see the substance. But it does make me very nervous. I think it's very easy to talk about red tape. It's very easy to talk about regulation. You've got to talk about what it's trying to do. And a lot of the things that were ported over were to do with workers' rights, were to do with protect. And by the way, things that we fought for within the European Union, we fought to win it across Europe. So, you know, let's see the detail. But I do hope parliamentarians like yourselves will be standing up and trying to protect these rather than allowing the government to have a free rein in hand.
Because one of the biggest bonuses so far of Brexit has been the fact that we are now paying workers in key areas like HGV drivers and others, where we have been lazily relying on imported cheap labour for too many years. And there are shortages in other European countries as well. We've not been paying properly and the conditions have not been good enough. That is now all changing and could not have changed if we were still part of the EU. That's a major, major bonus that is happening because
it was a government policy. You know, other governments pay their workers more, right? It comes down to the policy framework and the regulatory framework you create in the country. The idea that our bottom minimum wage is not high enough comes down to government decision. The idea that it's to do with Brexit, it's complete nonsense.
The government doesn't pay HGV drivers.
It is within...
The government can set minimum wages, but it's up to the industry to make sure it's looking after, investing in training of its workforce. That has not happened, and it's now starkly clear that it should have happened, because now we're having to homegrow our own. Quite rightly, we should have been doing that for years and years. We didn't under the EU.
I just wanted to say to me, one of the things the government could do because of Brexit, and one of the only things I think that the Labour Party have been pushing, is cutting VAT on fuel, and yet they won't do it. You know, Boris Johnson came out and said, if we leave Brexit... we've been calling for it for 3 months so far. We've been talking about this, and we've not heard...
want to come out of the EU in the first place, isn't it?
We've not heard anything from the government whatsoever on this.
But on this, why not? I mean, that is a freedom that you could actually use to cut VAT on energy bills.
And I'm absolutely not against it.
And would you support the Labour Party then in calling for this for the government?
Well, I want to know where the money is going to come from, because
we've talked about the windfall tax.
The windfall
that's where the money is going to come
on
from.
energy companies that made a huge loss last year, so that's not actually going to work. So the trouble is, if our energy bills are going up 50%,
so I'm saying this is something you could have from Brexit. This is something we could have from Brexit. This is something the Prime Minister said would happen, and yet again, the Prime Minister being, what was the word?
What do we need to do?
Promiscuous with the truth.
We need to solve energy prices for those who can least afford to pay them.
VAT
means that those with the highest energy prices, the richest, will get the biggest cut. It's not the most targeted way of helping those who really need the help.
One other big policy area, because there's been ongoing disagreement in your party, Tim, about the national insurance rise that is coming in April of 1.25%. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor wrote yesterday jointly that it should it?
I'm not a big fan of increasing national insurance.
But should it go ahead?
Well, it looks as though it's going to go ahead. I will prefer that there were other things that were looked at rather than raising this money. It's right that we are at last, as governments have ducked for too many years, looking at social care reform and putting more money there. And, of course, this money is going to the NHS. We desperately need to put more money into the NHS as well. I'm not sure that this is the fairest and most effective way of doing it.
All right, let's talk about your colleague, Rosie Duffield, Labour MP, because she has tweeted over the last 24 hours about considering her future within the Labour Party. This is because she says she's getting obsessive harassment from current and former members of the party, and that the party hasn't done enough about it. Let's just show everyone the tweet. Kent Police, Parliamentary Security Team and the Speaker's Office have been helpful, but it is the Labour Party that have offered me no support at all since I unexpectedly became an MP 5 years ago. I am today considering my future in the party very carefully. You're a friend of hers. I mean, how is she feeling? Is she on the verge of quitting?
Well, I was messaging her last night about this when I saw it and just offering my support. And she was saying in one of the groups that we're in, she's had an awful lot of support from other colleagues. And I think it's fair to say that Rosie's well liked across Parliament, actually. People have got a lot of time for Rosie. And it is awful, the amount of harassment that she's getting. But I wish I could say it was just Rosie, but I think it seems to be women in public life, women in politics, regardless of your political party, seem to be getting horrific amounts of abuse.
But in this particular case, because she's been very specific, has the Labour Party failed her?
I don't know exactly what the Labour Party's done or hasn't done. I know that she's been in touch with the leader's office because she said to me last night that someone had reached out and she's been having conversations with them. I've not spoken to her today to find out exactly how those conversations
She's saying they've offered me no support at all since I became an MP 5 years ago.
In which case, then I think they do need to offer her more support. I mean, all I know is that she's spoken to the leader's office. They've reached out to her and she's having those conversations.
Well, I mean, according to her, they haven't reached out to her.
Oh, well, this was after she sent this. I mean, she sent this tweet at 1:18 p.m. and we were messaging late last evening. So she's been in touch. But we know because she's been on this programme a number of times, and we know that she has had ongoing difficulties in terms of harassment. As you say, lots of MPs do. But this very specific case, what do you think the Labour Party actually needs to do? More support? What does it look like in order to keep Rosie Duffield in the party? I think we'd need to find out where's the harassment coming from. If the harassment's coming
from members and former members of the Labour Party.
If it's from members, then there are sanctions and there are actions that the Labour Party can take. You can look at, kicking someone out the party if they're being abusive to other people. If it's former members, then I'm not quite sure. You're looking at sort of what legal action any individual could take against somebody with a targeted campaign of harassment. But I do want to say, I mean, Rosie's a friend and someone I care about a lot, but she's really not the only one. And this needs to be a bigger and wider debate about how do we protect women who want to get involved in politics, women who want to stand for any political party, away from the levels of abuse and harassment that so many women face. And I'd like, I think we should be all unified on this issue.
What do you think these parties can do, Labour Party, all the main parties? Because clearly not enough is being done.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think being an MP is a really, really tough job. It's a brutal job. It's a hard job. And I don't think that actually the sort of duty of care that any employer would provide to its employees is given to MPs. They stand on their own. They have to kind of field issues on their own. If they're getting online abuse, they have to deal with it. And if they're overworked, there is literally no infrastructure around them. And I do think that needs to change because we need our MPs looked after because they do a really important job. And so for me, that's across the system. That's talking about what are the rights of MPs, what's the employment, whether it's maternity rights, paternity rights, a proper system so that the people that we are asking to represent us, can do that with the protections in order to be able to do that job perfectly.
All right, let's talk about education. We're joined now by Matthew Knott, who's written a book, A Class of Their Own, about being a private tutor to children of the UK and international elite. Matthew, welcome to you. What prompted you to write this book about your experiences?
Well, I think I have a story to tell that is only more pertinent with the inequalities that we've seen in the past few years. I became a tutor in the recession in 2008. I graduated and started working initially as a study buddy, which is where you're, invited to help kids do their homework, but helping means sort of playing a rather active role in that process. But then I progressed to a much more high-pressured type of tutoring, which really revolved around getting kids into particular oversubscribed private schools. And I also did some volunteer tutoring in the state sector, which obviously offered quite a contrast to all the Russian oligarchs and yummy mummies.
Right. Does it feel like it's become an arms race?
It really does. And I think an interesting thing is that certain private schools, we think of school as this thing which is local, is to do with community, but certain schools have become global brands. And this is something that they've encouraged with outreach and sister schools. And so it really is a global race. I was flown around the world to Moscow, to Dubai, to Miami, but clients who want to get their kids into these particular schools because they see that it is a conveyor belt into elite universities and prestigious professions. All
right, well, stay with us. Emma, you're a former teacher. Does it surprise you, listening to what Matthew has said, that some pupils do have this level of advantage of individual bespoke support?
No, it doesn't surprise me. It just makes me, I suppose, disappointed and sad for the ones who don't really. I mean, the government promised this national tutoring programme. There was lots of conversations. In fact, the Education Select Committee, Cross-Party Committee, raised concerns around the company that was using to provide this. It's not worked out effectively. We're being told they're teaching to empty classrooms. I mean, the education system at the moment in this country is in a mess. I think part of this has been the government's inability to foresee obvious problems, like, you know, the pandemic, you're told to stay at home. Well, aren't you going to need equipment to work on then? It took them months to work that out. It's taken 20 months for them to realise that we need ventilation. And I feel so desperately sorry, because we know that those children who go to private school, the advantage they've had is even greater because of the pandemic than it was before. And that's not fair, because it doesn't mean that those children are necessarily brighter or more capable. They've just had better advantage, and it's not a fair system.
On the tutoring programme, do you agree it hasn't been successful in the way it was outlined? Fewer than 10% of targeted pupils have started their tutoring sessions.
Yeah, it's got to be much more successful, and the catch-up problem that we are seeing now is a real issue, and I think there's been a lack of urgency. At the beginning of the pandemic, this call to arms went out to any retired doctors, nurses, medics to come back in and help out, and a huge amount did, and a huge amount of volunteers signed up to help as well. We need the same sort of programme in our schools for retired teachers, youth workers and others who can help get those kids back on track. And it's not just academically, it's also about the socialising they've missed out on, the huge impact on their mental health, which is seriously worrying, and all the other things that go with going to school. And that's why it was so important, and the government absolutely made the right calls on doing everything to keep those classrooms open for face-to-face. It was the unions, I'm afraid, the National Education Union, that triumphed, congratulated its members for closing down our schools at the beginning of last year, and that, I'm afraid, is where a lot of the fault lies.
And they haven't. We've got a situation now, we have 1 in 10 school teachers at the moment are off work because they have COVID. My daughter was off school last week because she had COVID. You know, we're having problems getting work set from the school because a number of teachers are off work because they've got COVID. What the unions were doing was highlighting a real and legitimate problem in school. I want my daughter in school.
Emma,
I want children. No, I want children. I want children in school. The government's failed to deal with this. Sage 20 months ago said you need ventilation in schools if you want children to go back. 20 months ago, and nothing has happened. They're doing a study at the moment in Bradford that's not going to report on the effectiveness of ventilation until October.
All right, well, let's stick.
It's nonsense. Urgency.
Let's stick with the gap between privately educated and state-educated children, particularly in this catch-up mode since the height of the pandemic. Kate, how do you address this unfairness in the education system?
It's really difficult, and frankly, I think we're going to need more resources, but we've decided collectively, certainly the Conservative Party, that any more resources we can get are going to go to the National Health Service and social care instead. And these are the difficult trade-offs that we have to discuss and we decided to make. But you know, these numbers are shocking, but we can't act surprised. The catastrophic impact of lockdown and taking children out of schools, especially the poorest and most vulnerable, was always going to have very, very long-term consequences. And it was almost taboo to talk about this in 2020, but we all knew it was going to have catastrophic effect, that we were going to be wiping out, some even estimated, a decade's worth of social mobility. And, you know, I'm looking forward to reading this book. The fights and cattiness of the rich and famous to get their children to the top is certainly a fascinating conversation. But frankly, I'm much more interested in what happens to kids at the bottom end of the spectrum. And we found out spring 2021 last year that 20,000 students had fallen off the school register completely. Yes. What's happening to children? And we should have been able to speak about this much earlier on when we could have done more about it. Because yes, we're going to need resources now, but frankly, for some of those kids, the catch-up will be too late. And we as a society are going to have to deal with that for the rest of our lives.
Is tutoring the right way to have addressed the gap and also the fact that actually it got worse during the pandemic?
Well, no, I think, look, we've got a bigger structural problem. So the pandemic has only highlighted the issues that were there before. And I think a big part of it does go to underinvestment in our education system. We don't pay our teachers enough for the valuable work that they do. And actually, there's a whole set of softer, you know, extracurricular activities that kids in private schools get that builds that confidence, that builds that emotional intelligence that we're not providing in our state schools. So we need a big, big programme if we want to try to level up.
And Matthew, you agree with that point, don't you, from Miata, in terms of the self-confidence that you discovered when you were tutoring certainly privately educated pupils?
Yeah, I think that one of the differences I noticed between there was a time where I was preparing a wealthy pupil to apply to Oxbridge and also helping a girl in an academy, and she was extremely intelligent, but the issue was more one of confidence and of not having been trained from quite a young age to have these kind of not only sort of social presentation for a particular environment, but just this belief that, that ascending into these elite universities and positions of power is sort of where you belong. And it's really hard, I can speak to the value of tutoring, but it's really hard to see anytime you give one child an advantage, there are obviously going to be others that miss out.
Tim, what do you say to that?
Matthew is right. It's not just about the experience in the classroom. It's about all the extracurricular activities that go with it, the team building, whether it be CCF or whatever. Actually, in my constituency, the largest private school is part of a charitable train where we've got a local academy. And the interaction between the two, so that the kids at the academy state school benefit from what's going on in the private school, that's what we want. We want to mix this up more. But there's an important point, Jo, here as well, because the attainment gap, which we have this problem, 18 months behind at GCSE level that a lot of our kids are, 40% of that attainment gap is down to before they actually started school. So a really big problem here is to make sure that we've got kids who are school ready, who've had some of the advantages that the kids who have got middle class parents and have got parents with who are able to buy more time with them, that all kids get those opportunities. And we need to be doing much more upstream, which is why the Best Start programme, which Angela Leadsom has piloted and which the government's now put £500 million into for starters, is so important. You've got to start early.
Just briefly on the policy, Labour's policy to strip private schools of their charitable status. You just heard what Tim has said, that actually schools working together, private schools and state schools, is a benefit to both sides, I should think.
Well, if you strip them of their charitable status, you might be able to put more money into the state schools. And just on the point of looking at the early start, I do agree with Tim. Early years is crucially important. So why did the government decide to get rid of Sure Start to begin with? And on the point around confidence and articulation, I do want to mention I've been championing since I've got in oracy. I've set up an all-party group looking at the importance of oracy, looking at giving children those skills in terms of articulation and how they express themselves. I was stonewalled a bit by the previous Minister for Schools. I'm hoping the new minister is going to be more sympathetic to what I'm trying to do, because you're right, a lot of it comes down to confidence. It's not ability, it is not to do with talent, sometimes it is to do with confidence, and that's what we need to give our children from state schools, the same opportunities.
We've got to move on. I'll say thank you to Matthew, but just before we do, you were shaking your head there, Tim, at Labour's policy of private schools getting the tax break. Why should they get those tax breaks? They get paid about £30,000 a year in terms of fees, private schools. And
also, they save the state an enormous amount of money for those kids not going to state schools. I mean, it's this notion, we've all agreed that kids coming out of private schools are by and large doing better, getting better academic qualifications. So why don't we try and make all our schools like what they're doing so successfully in private schools? And the Labour idea that you tear down great schools, great education in order to benefit everybody else is just completely pie in the sky. It's the levelling down mentality that we know doesn't work.
You're talking about giving money you're talking about giving them charitable status, giving them even greater advantage than they had before. We're talking about giving that to the children who most need it.
So they don't support the academies at all then?
We're running out of time. We've got to move on to our final story. Let me just show you this headline in The Guardian. Spotify to direct listeners to accurate COVID information after Joe Rogan outcry. This is the news that Spotify has said it will add advice and warnings to podcasts on its platforms that discuss COVID-19. The company has been criticised for its work with the US podcaster Joe Rogan. His programme is the most popular podcast on Spotify with 200 million downloads a month. Now, he has previously hosted guests sceptical about COVID vaccines and said that people who are young and healthy don't need to get vaccinated. The musicians, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, have now asked Spotify to remove their music from the platform. Joni Mitchell said in a statement, "Irresponsible people are spreading lies that are costing people their lives." Joe Rogan has responded to that with a video he posted on Instagram. Let's take a look.
I'm not trying to promote misinformation. I'm not trying to be controversial. I've never tried to do anything with this podcast other than just talk to people and have interesting conversations. Thank you, all the supporters, and even thank you to the haters, because it's good to have some haters. It makes you reassess what you're doing and put things into perspective, and I think that's good too.
Kate, who should be leaving Spotify, Joni Mitchell and Neil Young or Joe Rogan?
Well, ideally, nobody. Ideally, people like Neil Young, who came up at a time where people would accuse his own music of tainting the minds of the young, and, you know, words can be violence. You know, he pushed back on all that. And I think it's really disappointing now to see that he would want that kind of censorship applied to such a big platform like Spotify. Ideally, you would have it all. But I think Spotify's made the right call by saying, you know, you're not going to give us these ultimatums. If you want to take your music with you, fine. No doubt there's a commercial element to this as well. I think Spotify bought the Joe Rogan podcast for about $100 million worth of the deal. So I'm sure there's a commercial element here, but I think it's impressive that Spotify, has decided to stick by, frankly, the more controversial decision. I was maybe one of the 3 people on the planet, apparently, who wasn't listening to Joe Rogan's podcast.
No, I think there are a few more, actually, one here.
I wasn't listening to it. I plan to now. I think the video that he put out is a remarkable response. It is very polite. It praises Neil Young and Joni Mitchell. It talks about areas he thinks he can get it better. He's admitted that when he has controversial guests on, he wants to get more balance and he wants to push back more. So I think it's been a really healthy conversation. And I think ultimately Spotify made the right decision not to be put into a corner with an ultimatum.
Do you agree with that, Miata? I mean, Spotify released a statement last night where they said we have an obligation to do more to provide balance and access to widely accepted information from the medical and scientific communities guiding us through this unprecedented time. Neil Young said Spotify can either have Rogan or me.
Well, look, they do have an obligation, and at the moment they're very lax with that obligation because there's no real strong global regulatory environment that says you've got to provide balanced information, you can't have misinformation, you have to be held by a particular standard. And so, for me, the onus sits with the platform, but actually we need a structure around these platforms that forces them to act in the public good and not to disseminate information or provide information that's not balanced, which is the sort of standard we expect for other broadcasters. So for me, it comes back to the regulatory environment. And until then, of course, they'll, say one thing and do another thing.
Kate?
Who creates that structure? A year ago, it was misinformation to suggest that the coronavirus may have been developed in a lab and not in a meat market. That was considered misinformation. People were widely criticized that they were being unscientific. Now that is predominantly the most popular theory. I'm very against misinformation. I think everybody is, we can all agree on that. But when you start talking about regulatory environments, who's going to set those parameters, that becomes a much more difficult conversation, which is why it's always better to have more opinions out there, more speech, and certainly knock down the really crazy ones, but have that through dialogue, not through you have Neil Young, you have Joe Rogan, and you can't have both.
No one is talking about censorship, but actually in other forms of media, we manage to have a standard of information, a standard of public information that's put out there, but also balanced views. That's the standard that the BBC have to operate along. So why can't we expect the same of our social media platform, where it's the wild west of information?
In real time, it's a wonderful goal, but it's a much more difficult conversation. Just regulate this, and then this won't happen. We are used to, as Twitter users, as Spotify users, being able to access things in real time. One of the benefits that the BBC, the Spectator, all other kinds of media outlets have is that we aren't necessarily doing things in exactly real time. It's not that we can just put any opinion out there and not have it checked. You will fundamentally change how people use these platforms, and possibly for the worse.
We've only got a few seconds left. Should they have stuck with Joe Rogan?
Yeah, I'm against the cancel culture, and frankly, these artists need to get over themselves. I think the best quote came from James Blunt, who tweeted, "If Spotify doesn't immediately remove Joe Rogan, I will release new music onto the platform." I think that sums it up.
Dale, go.
Well, I'll always agree with Neil Young generally as a rule of thumb, so there we go.
Well, on that, and we've got that statement, of course, this afternoon at 3:30 from the Prime Minister. I will be back tomorrow with all the analysis of that at 12:15 with Politics Live. Bye-bye.